My beloved child, something was written in silence tonight that was never meant to remain hidden this long. Not a casual message. Not a passing thought. A letter. And the strange thing is, the person you love did not begin it with an explanation. They began it with your name, then stopped. For several minutes, nothing else was written. Imagine that moment. A quiet room. A glowing screen or a folded page resting beneath their hands. Your name sitting there alone while every emotion they had carefully controlled began rising at once. Because this letter was not created to impress you. It was created because pretending had finally become more difficult than telling the truth. And there is one detail you need to hear. They almost erased it. Their hand moved toward the page as if they were ready to destroy every sentence before you could ever discover what had been placed there. But they stopped. Why? Because one thought entered their mind with unexpected force. What if tomorrow is too late to say what I should have said today? That single question changed the entire letter. Suddenly, the words became different. More honest. More vulnerable. More specific. They started writing about moments you probably believed they had forgotten. A conversation that seemed ordinary. A look you gave them when neither of you knew what to say. A time when you stepped away believing your presence had made no difference. But according to this letter, it made more difference than you ever realized. There is a sentence near the beginning that changes the meaning of everything that follows. It says, in essence, I kept acting as though I was confused about you, when the truth was that I was frightened by how certain I already felt. Hold that thought. Because certainty is not what you were shown. You were shown hesitation. Distance. Mixed signals. Silence where answers should have been. And perhaps that is why this secret letter matters so much. It reveals that what looked like indifference from the outside may have been an internal struggle they did not know how to explain. But something happened recently. Something small enough that nobody else would have noticed it. They came across something connected to you. Maybe an old photograph. A saved message. A familiar phrase. A memory attached to a place. Whatever it was, it interrupted their ordinary day and pulled them directly into a realization they had been postponing. They could imagine moving forward. They could imagine changing routines. They could even imagine building an entirely different future. But every version of that future contained the same unanswered space. You. And that is where the letter becomes unexpectedly powerful. Because they did not write, I miss you. That would have been simple. They wrote something much deeper. I miss the version of myself that existed when I still believed I had time to tell you everything. Read that again inside your heart. This is no longer simply about affection. It is about timing. Regret. Possibility. And the realization that some truths become heavier the longer they remain unspoken. Yet the most important confession is still missing. They deliberately left it until the final lines. Even while writing, they hesitated to put those words on the page. Why would someone hide the most important sentence until the very end? Because once that sentence exists, they can no longer pretend they do not know what they want. Stay with this story a little longer when the next part arrives. Because before this letter reaches its final confession, you need to know what happened immediately after they finished writing your name for the second time. They received something they were not expecting. And after seeing it, they added one completely new paragraph to the letter. That paragraph is where the future suddenly begins to change. The second your name appeared on their screen again, the entire mood of the room changed. Not because someone called them. Not because another person entered. But because an old message suddenly appeared in front of them, one they had not searched for, one they had almost forgotten existed. And inside that message was something you had once said without realizing how deeply it would stay with them. You had written words that sounded simple at the time. Something about wanting honesty more than perfection. Something about choosing truth even when truth arrives late. They stared at that sentence. Then they looked back at the unfinished letter. For the first time, they understood why they had been unable to complete it. They had been trying to write the version of the story that made them look composed. But this letter could not survive behind composure. So they deleted an entire paragraph. Then another. And what they wrote next was much more revealing. I thought distance would make this easier. Instead, distance showed me what mattered. That was the moment the letter stopped being an explanation and became a confession. Because the person you love began admitting things they had never even admitted clearly to themselves. They admitted that there were days when they deliberately avoided checking for your name. Not because they wanted to forget you. Because seeing your name created a question they were not ready to answer. What would happen if they finally stopped resisting what they felt? Pause there. Because that question leads directly toward the final confession. For a long time, they believed feelings could be managed like schedules. Wait long enough. Stay busy enough. Think logically enough. Eventually everything would settle into something easier. But instead, every attempt to move forward kept revealing another piece of unfinished emotion. A song sounded different. A familiar street carried another meaning. A future plan somehow made them wonder where you would be. Even conversations with other people became strange, because occasionally someone would ask an innocent question about love, commitment, or the future. And your face would enter their mind before they could stop it. That frightened them more than they expected. Because thoughts can be dismissed. Patterns are harder to ignore. And you had become a pattern inside their imagination of tomorrow. Not yesterday. Tomorrow. That distinction changed everything. They were no longer simply remembering you. They were unconsciously placing you inside possibilities that had not happened yet. A home they had never seen. A morning that had not arrived. A conversation years into the future. Small ordinary moments that somehow felt incomplete whenever they imagined experiencing them without you. This is why another sentence was added to the secret letter. I kept calling you part of my past because admitting you were still part of my future felt too dangerous. There it is. A truth beneath the truth. And if this story is speaking to something inside you, share it with someone who understands quiet emotions, leave a comment with the word truth, and subscribe so you can continue this journey when the next chapter unfolds. Because something even more unexpected happened after that sentence was written. The person you love stood up. Walked away from the letter. Then returned several minutes later carrying something they had kept hidden. Something connected directly to you. It was not expensive. It was not dramatic. But the fact that they had kept it all this time proved something their words had been trying to avoid. They placed it beside the letter and whispered a question into the empty room. Why did I keep this if I truly believed I was finished? No answer came immediately. Then their eyes moved toward the final blank space at the bottom of the page. Only a few lines remained. And suddenly they knew exactly what belonged there. But they still could not write it. Because the final confession was not simply, I love you. It contained a decision. A decision about what they intended to do next. And once those words were written, this secret letter would no longer be about remembering what happened between you. It would become a doorway toward what could happen next. The pen touched the page. One sentence appeared. Then they stopped again. Because the first 5 words of that final confession changed the meaning of everything you thought this letter was going to say. Then came the sentence they had been avoiding all night. 5 words. Quiet enough to look harmless on the page. Powerful enough to make them put the pen down immediately afterward. I already know my answer. For a moment, even they seemed surprised by what they had written. Because until that instant, the person you love had described everything as uncertainty. Wrong timing. Complicated circumstances. Too many questions. Too much distance. But those 5 words exposed something different. Maybe the confusion was never about how they felt. Maybe the confusion was about what they were willing to do with those feelings. And that distinction changes the entire letter. They leaned back and reread everything from the beginning. Your name. The memories. The apologies they had struggled to phrase correctly. The admission that distance had not erased you. The strange realization that whenever they pictured the future, your presence appeared somewhere inside it. Then they reached those 5 words again. I already know my answer. This time, they did not look away. Something inside them had finally become still. Not dramatic. Not impulsive. Clear. And clarity can be more powerful than emotion because emotion asks, what am I feeling? Clarity asks, what am I going to do now? That is why the next section of the letter becomes so important. They started describing a moment you never knew had happened. Recently, someone asked them a simple question about the future. Where do you see yourself later? What kind of life do you actually want? They could have answered with work, travel, plans, goals. Instead, their mind went somewhere unexpected. To an ordinary morning. 2 cups sitting somewhere nearby. A familiar voice. A peaceful conversation. No performance. No uncertainty. And somehow, you were there. That image stayed with them long after the conversation ended. Not because it was spectacular. Because it felt natural. That frightened them. Extraordinary fantasies are easy to dismiss. But when someone begins imagining ordinary life with you, something deeper is being revealed. The secret letter admits this. I stopped asking whether you belonged in my life. I started wondering why I had spent so long imagining a life where I pretended you didn't. The words sat there. Unedited. They normally changed sentences that made them feel too exposed. Not this one. They left it exactly as it was. Because tonight, perfection was no longer the goal. Truth was. But there was still one problem. This letter had been written. It had been completed almost to the final line. Yet you still had not received it. Why? Because sending it meant surrendering control over what happened next. Once you read it, you could respond however you chose. You could need time. You could ask questions. You could even tell them that words were not enough anymore. And strangely, they understood that. In fact, another line appeared. If I come toward you now, I know I cannot arrive carrying only promises. That sentence changed their entire plan. They realized the confession at the end of the letter needed proof behind it. Not grand gestures. Not impossible guarantees. Something simpler. Consistency. Courage. A willingness to finally have the conversation they had postponed. And then something extraordinary happened. They opened their calendar. They looked at tomorrow. One particular hour was already marked. At first, it seemed unrelated to you. Then they erased what was there. The empty space remained on the screen. And beside the unfinished letter, they wrote a tiny note containing only 3 words. Tell them tomorrow. Now you understand why this letter feels urgent. Tomorrow is not merely a deadline. Tomorrow is connected to a decision. But there is still one final sentence you have not heard. The sentence placed at the absolute bottom of the page. The confession they rewrote 3 separate times before finally leaving it untouched. And here is what makes it different from everything else. It does not describe what they felt yesterday. It reveals what they are prepared to choose next. What happened next was not written in the letter at first. It happened after the letter was finished. After the final sentence had already been placed at the bottom of the page. After the person you love had convinced themselves that there was nothing more to add. They folded the page. Or perhaps they closed the document. They stood there for a moment, staring at what they had created, carrying the strange relief that comes when a truth finally leaves the mind and becomes something real. Then they noticed something. One sentence in the middle of the letter no longer felt complete. Not wrong. Incomplete. And that realization made them open everything again. Because the confession at the end could not stand alone. It needed context. It needed you to understand something they had never explained. Something about why they had remained silent for so long. Something about the exact moment they realized that losing the connection completely would hurt more than facing the uncertainty of trying again. So they returned to the page. And this time, they did not begin with an apology. They wrote, "There was a moment when I almost reached out, and you never knew." Pause here. Because this is where the story changes direction. You may have believed there were long stretches when they were simply living their life without thinking about you. But according to this letter, at least one of those quiet stretches contained a moment that came dangerously close to becoming a conversation. They had your contact open. Your name was directly in front of them. A message had already been typed. Not a dramatic paragraph. Not an emotional speech. Just a simple opening. Something like, "Can we talk?" They stared at those words. Then deleted them. Why? The letter finally answers that question. They were afraid that approaching you without knowing what they truly wanted would create another cycle of uncertainty. They had already seen what hesitation could do. They knew that entering your life again with half-finished intentions would be unfair. And perhaps this is one of the most surprising parts of the entire confession. Their silence was not always because they did not care enough. Sometimes, it was because they knew caring was not enough. They needed direction. They needed courage. They needed to become capable of standing behind what they said. And that process took longer than they expected. The letter describes nights when they tried to imagine two futures. One where they never spoke to you again. Another where they finally told you everything. At first, both seemed possible. Then something subtle started happening. Whenever they imagined the first future, it felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. There were achievements. Movement. New places. Different routines. But a certain emotional color seemed missing. Then they pictured the second future. Not a perfect reunion. Not some impossible story where every problem disappeared instantly. A real conversation. Questions. Honest answers. Maybe awkward pauses. Maybe difficult admissions. But underneath all of it, something felt alive. That was the difference. One future felt safe. The other felt true. And somewhere between safety and truth, they began understanding what they had been choosing against. There is a line in the letter that captures this realization. "I kept protecting myself from one difficult conversation, and I almost created a lifetime of unanswered questions." That sentence remained untouched. No rewriting. No correction. Because by then, they had stopped trying to sound wise. They were simply telling you what happened inside them. Now look at the timing. Tomorrow. Why tomorrow? Why did they write that small note tell them tomorrow, instead of another date? The answer is hidden in something that happened earlier that same day. They were asked to make a decision about their future. Not necessarily about romance. It could have been work. A change of environment. A commitment. A new direction. Something that would affect the next chapter of their life. And while considering that decision, they suddenly realized something startling. They were about to make another major choice without ever telling you what you meant to them. That thought stopped them. Because whatever tomorrow brings, they no longer wanted to carry the same unfinished truth into it. The letter became their line in the sand. A private declaration that the next version of their life could not be built around avoidance. And now we reach the page they almost removed completely. It begins differently from everything before it. No explanation. No careful wording. Just, "You deserve to know what was happening inside me." They then admitted that you may have interpreted certain moments differently than they intended. When they became quiet, you may have thought they were losing interest. When they stepped backward, you may have assumed they were choosing another direction. When they failed to say something important, you may have concluded there was nothing important to say. But the letter reveals a contradiction. Their outward behavior became quieter at exactly the same time their inner world was becoming louder. That does not excuse confusion. The letter does not try to excuse it. In fact, this is one of the most mature moments in the confession. They write that intentions do not erase impact. They understand that whatever was happening inside them, you could only respond to what they actually showed you. And what they showed you may not have been enough. They finally see that. Perhaps that is why this letter feels different from a fantasy. They are not asking you to forget the past. They are acknowledging it. They are not demanding that you trust immediately. They are offering truth. And then comes another revelation. They kept one specific memory of you hidden from everyone. Nobody around them knew how important it had become. It was not your most dramatic moment together. It was something almost embarrassingly ordinary. You were talking about the future once. Not necessarily the two of you. Just life. What you wanted. Who you hoped to become. Something you said that day stayed with them. You spoke about wanting a life that felt peaceful rather than impressive. You wanted something genuine. Something where you did not have to constantly question where you stood. At the time, they listened. But they did not fully understand. Now they do. Because the letter says, "I finally understand why you valued peace so much. You were not asking for perfection. You were asking not to live inside confusion." That realization hit them harder than almost anything else they wrote. Because they began seeing the connection from your side. Not only through their emotions. Through your experience. And for the first time, they asked themselves a different question. Not, "Do I love this person?" But, "Can I love them in a way that actually feels safe, clear, and consistent?" That is a much harder question. And they did not answer it quickly. They sat with it. They considered their habits. Their fear of difficult conversations. Their tendency to withdraw when emotions became too real. The ways they sometimes waited for certainty before taking action, even though certainty often arrives only after action begins. And something in them shifted. They realized love could not simply remain an emotion privately experienced. At some point, it had to become behavior. Presence. Choice. Communication. So the final confession was rewritten again. But do not rush there yet. Because the most revealing thing happened just before they changed it. They looked at the object they had placed beside the letter earlier. The thing connected to you that they had kept. Maybe a note. A photograph. A small gift. A ticket. A tiny reminder that should have become meaningless by now if their feelings had truly faded. They picked it up. And for the first time, they asked why they had protected it through every attempt to move forward. The answer arrived almost immediately. It was never really about the object. It represented a version of the connection that had felt honest. A moment when neither of you was trying to predict the future. A moment when there was only presence. No strategy. No fear. No complicated story surrounding it. Just two people existing in the same moment. And they wanted that honesty back. Not necessarily the exact past. Something better. Something more conscious. A connection built with the knowledge they have now. That is where the futuristic vision inside this letter becomes almost cinematic. They begin describing what they no longer want. No more guessing games. No more waiting for the perfect moment. No more constructing entire conversations inside their head without ever having the real one. Then they describe what they do want. A beginning based on truth. A future where questions are asked instead of assumed. Where feelings are spoken before silence distorts them. Where neither person has to chase certainty alone. And there is one sentence that feels almost like they are speaking directly across time to you. If there is still a doorway between us, I do not want to stand outside it forever wondering what would have happened if I had knocked. That was when they stopped writing again. They read the sentence aloud. Once. Then twice. And suddenly the final confession became clear. But they still had one fear. What if you had changed? What if the version of you they were writing to no longer existed? What if your life had moved forward? What if you had learned to protect your peace so carefully that their return would feel like an interruption rather than an answer? For several minutes, that possibility almost made them close the letter. Then they understood something important. The purpose of honesty is not to control another person's response. It is to stop hiding your own truth. So they decided the letter would not pressure you. It would not tell you what you must feel. It would not demand a specific ending. Instead, it would give you something you may have been missing for a long time. Clarity. That choice transformed the final paragraph. They removed every sentence that sounded like persuasion. Every sentence trying to convince you. Every promise too large to prove today. And what remained was simple. Real. Almost disarmingly calm. They wrote. I cannot decide what this means for you. I can only decide that I will stop hiding what it means for me. Now the letter was no longer a plea. It was a declaration. And something about that made them breathe differently. They were no longer preparing to chase. They were preparing to be known. There is a difference. A person who chases an outcome is terrified of losing control. A person who chooses honesty accepts that truth has consequences. Whatever your response may eventually be, they have decided that silence can no longer make the decision for both of you. And if this unfolding story has been pulling you forward, you can share it with someone who believes honest conversations can change a future. Leave a comment with the word clarity, and subscribe if you want to continue when the next revelation arrives. Because we are finally approaching the sentence that changes everything. But there is one detail left. One small act they performed after completing the confession. They took the letter and added a date. Tomorrow's date. Not at the top. At the bottom. Right beneath the final words. Why would they do that? Because they wanted to remember the day they stopped running from their own answer. Then they placed the letter somewhere they would see it again in the morning. Somewhere impossible to ignore. Beside their keys. Near their phone. On a table they pass before leaving. A physical reminder. No more postponing. And for the first time all night, they smiled. Not because they knew what would happen. Because they knew what they were going to do. There is enormous power in that difference. The future had been frightening when it was only a cloud of possibilities. Now there was one clear next step. Speak. Tell you the truth. Allow reality to replace imagination. And suddenly all those months of internal questions seemed to collapse into a single decision. But the story does not end with tomorrow. Something even stranger happened while they were imagining the conversation. They realized they did not want to return merely to restart what existed before. They wanted to meet you again as the person they had become. They wanted to know who you had become too. Because time changes people. Silence changes people. Lessons change people. And perhaps the greatest mistake would be assuming that either of you is still exactly who you were at the beginning. So the letter makes room for something new. Not repetition. Reintroduction. A chance to approach each other without forcing old expectations onto a new chapter. That is why one of the final lines says, "If we speak again, I do not want to begin by asking whether we can go back. I want to ask whether there is something better we can build forward. Forward. That word matters. The entire letter begins with memory. But it ends with direction. This person is no longer writing only about what they miss. They are writing about what they are prepared to create differently. And now, finally, they reach the confession. Their hand slows. Their breathing changes. Every previous sentence has been preparing for this one. They write your name again. Then. The truth is, I did not write this letter because I suddenly discovered that I love you. No. That would be too simple. The next sentence is where everything turns. They continue. I wrote it because I finally stopped pretending that love was the part one was uncertain about. Think about that. All this time, uncertainty may have seemed like the central problem. But according to this confession, the emotion itself was not uncertain. What frightened them was everything love would require. Honesty. Change. Responsibility. The possibility of being vulnerable without knowing how the story would end. They spent so much time trying to remove risk that they nearly removed possibility too. Now they see it. And the final confession continues. I know what I feel. I know who I think about when I imagine the life I actually want. And if I stay silent now, I will not be protecting myself anymore. I will only be choosing fear over something real. They stop. Then one last line appears beneath it. The line they rewrote 3 times. The line that caused them to sit silently afterward. The line that turns this from a secret love letter into a decision. It says, so tomorrow, I am not going to wait for another sign, I'm going to tell you myself. That is the confession. Not merely that they love you. That they have decided to stop leaving the truth hidden inside private pages. Tomorrow represents movement. A conversation. A moment when whatever has lived only inside thoughts may finally enter reality. And yet there is still something you do not know. Because after writing that final line, they did something they had not planned. They turned the letter over. On the back, they wrote one additional sentence. A sentence separate from everything else. Almost like a private postscript. And strangely, that postscript may matter even more than the confession itself. Because it reveals what they will ask you when the two of you finally speak. Not whether you still love them. Not whether you forgive them. Not whether you can return to what existed before. Their question is completely different. And depending on your answer, it could define the entire next chapter. There was one question on the back of that letter that changed the meaning of everything written before it. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was almost painfully simple. The person you love had spent hours writing about memories, timing, hesitation, regret, and everything they had finally understood about you. Yet when the page was turned over, none of those subjects appeared. There was only one handwritten sentence. If we could begin again without pretending the past never happened, what would you want us to do differently? They stared at it for a long time. That was the question. Not, do you still love me? Not, will you take me back? Not even, can you forgive me? They wanted to know whether something wiser could exist between you now. And perhaps that is the most revealing thing they have written yet. Because people who only want relief usually ask for reassurance. People who are finally ready for change begin asking better questions. The person you love no longer wanted an answer that would simply make them feel safe. They wanted an answer that could help both of you build something honest. That is why they placed the question on the back. It felt separate from the confession. The front of the letter belonged to everything they needed you to know. The back belonged to everything they were finally ready to learn about you. What if that difference becomes the turning point? Think about how many connections become trapped because one person spends years preparing a speech while forgetting that the other person also has a story. The person you love almost made that mistake. At first, the entire letter was centered on their awakening. Their feelings. their regret, their realization. But somewhere in the final hour, they understood that if tomorrow truly became the beginning of a different chapter, they could not arrive only prepared to speak. They had to arrive prepared to listen. So another private decision was made. When the conversation happens, they will not interrupt your truth just because part of it may be difficult to hear. They will not defend every silence. They will not explain away every confusing moment. They will allow you to describe what the distance felt like from where you stood. And that intention changes the energy of the entire story. Because this is no longer someone simply saying, "Here is how much I care." It is someone beginning to understand that care without understanding can still leave wounds of confusion. The letter was teaching them that love cannot only be measured by intensity. It must also be measured by awareness. Can I see you? Can I hear you? Can I understand what my choices created for you? Can I remain present when the answer is uncomfortable? These were not questions they had asked themselves before. Now they could not stop asking them. And then another memory returned. A moment between you that once seemed insignificant. You had been trying to explain something. Not necessarily something dramatic. Maybe you were describing why a certain situation made you uncomfortable. Maybe you were trying to tell them what you needed. Maybe you simply wanted an honest answer. But instead of fully listening, they had been preparing their response while you were still speaking. They remembered it clearly now. The expression on your face changed. Just slightly. You realized they were hearing your words without truly receiving them. At the time, they did not recognize what happened. Tonight, while rereading the letter, they did. And they whispered, "I missed what you were really trying to tell me." That memory would not leave. So they returned to the page again. You might think the letter had already been finished several times by now. It had. But truth has a strange way of opening new rooms once you stop locking the first door. They added another paragraph. This one was shorter. "I thought understanding my feelings was the hardest part. It wasn't. The hardest part was learning that loving you also means being willing to understand your experience, even when it doesn't match mine." That sentence may matter more than it first appears. Because two people can live through the same connection and experience completely different realities. One person remembers needing time. The other remembers being left uncertain. One person remembers protecting themselves. The other remembers feeling shut out. One person remembers waiting for the right moment. The other remembers wondering why the moment never came. Both experiences can be real. And suddenly the person you love was mature enough to see that. No villain. No enemy. No need to rewrite the past. Just two human beings trying to understand something powerful with the emotional tools they had at the time. Perhaps tomorrow will not be about proving who was right. Perhaps it will be about finally understanding what was true for both of you. And that possibility gave them a peace they had not expected. They had been imagining the conversation as something enormous. Almost like one perfect moment would need to resolve every unanswered question. But now they realized that was another form of pressure. One conversation does not have to repair everything. One letter does not have to solve everything. One confession does not have to guarantee the future. Sometimes the most important thing a conversation can do is create enough honesty for the next conversation to become possible. That became their new intention. Not to arrive with a finished future. To arrive with an open door. Something about this realization made them look at the clock. It was later than they thought. Tomorrow was getting closer. And for the first time, the approaching morning did not make them nervous. It made them focused. They began imagining how they would actually approach you. Not the words from the letter. The moment before the words. Would they message first? Would they call? Would they wait until they could speak face to face? They considered every possibility. Then something surprised them. They realized that the exact method mattered less than the honesty behind it. There had been a time when they obsessed over the perfect opening line. Now they understood that perfection had already cost too much time. So they wrote another tiny note beside the first one. No performance. Only 2 words. No performance. That was their promise to themselves. They would not try to sound mysterious. They would not hide behind humor. They would not pretend the conversation mattered less than it did. They would not create another puzzle for you to solve. They would simply be present. Maybe their voice would shake. Maybe there would be pauses. Maybe they would forget half the beautiful lines written in this secret letter. But they would finally be real. Isn't it strange? Sometimes the future does not change when someone finds the perfect words. It changes when they stop using words as a shield. And now the letter had become something else entirely. At the beginning, they wrote because they were afraid they might never tell you. By the end, writing had given them the courage to speak. The page was no longer a substitute for action. It had become preparation for action. Then another unexpected thought appeared. What if they gave you the letter only after the conversation? Not before. They had assumed the letter would do the speaking for them. But suddenly they wanted you to hear the truth directly first. To look at them. To hear the tone of their voice. To know they were not hiding somewhere behind carefully edited sentences. The letter could come afterward. Something you could read privately. Something that would contain the thoughts they might struggle to explain in one conversation. But their presence would come first. That decision felt important. Because they did not want you to receive 3,000 words of emotion and then be left alone wondering what to do with them. They wanted to be available for your questions. Available for silence. Available for whatever your honest reaction might be. That is when their fear returned. Not loudly. Quietly. What if the answer isn't what I hope? They sat with that question. This time, they did not run from it. What if you said you needed space? What if you said your trust would need time? What if you told them that while you appreciate the truth, you cannot immediately return to the same emotional place? What if you surprised them completely? The old version of them would have treated those possibilities like reasons not to speak. The person writing this letter now saw them differently. Your freedom to answer honestly was part of what made the conversation real. Love could not mean asking you to be truthful only when the truth made them comfortable. So another sentence went into the letter. I am telling you this because you deserve the truth, not because you owe me the answer I want. They read that line several times. And with each reading, something inside them became calmer. Because the burden of controlling the outcome disappeared. They could choose honesty. You could choose your response. And whatever came next would at least be built on reality rather than assumptions. But there is still another layer. Something they had not admitted yet. The person you love had been afraid of your answer, yes. But they were even more afraid of one particular question you might ask them. Why now? Why after all this time? Why did clarity suddenly arrive now? Why did you have to wonder before they finally understood? They knew that question might come. So they prepared to answer it. Not with excuses. With truth. The truth was that there had not been one magical moment where everything became obvious. It happened slowly. A collection of small recognitions. The way certain achievements felt incomplete when there was nobody they truly wanted to tell. The way they noticed themselves comparing moments of connection to what they once felt with you. The way your absence became less like a dramatic pain and more like a quiet shape in ordinary life. That distinction mattered. They had expected that if their feelings were real, they would experience some huge undeniable sign. Instead, what convinced them was much quieter. Consistency. You kept appearing in the spaces that mattered. Not constantly. Not obsessively. But naturally. When they imagined honesty, you came to mind. When they imagined emotional safety, they remembered certain moments with you. When they imagined who had seen through their defenses without trying to embarrass them, they remembered you. And eventually they could no longer call that coincidence. They began to understand that clarity is not always lightning. Sometimes clarity is simply the same truth returning until you finally stop arguing with it. That was what had happened. And then came the realization they wrote in the margin rather than the main letter. I didn't suddenly choose you tonight. Tonight I finally admitted how long I had been choosing you privately. That sentence startled even them. Because it explained so much. Their private choices had never become visible. They had protected memories. Protected your name in conversations. Protected the part of themselves that still cared. They had refused certain possibilities because something did not feel right, even when they could not explain why. They had carried the connection internally. But you could not see any of that. Private loyalty can feel meaningful to the person experiencing it. To the person outside, it can look exactly like silence. And they finally understood that invisible love cannot ask to be recognized as though it had been openly given. That is why tomorrow matters. It is the moment when the private becomes visible. Not everything. Just enough. Enough for you to stop having to guess what the letter makes clear. And then, while looking at tomorrow's date beneath the final confession, the person you love imagined a possibility that made them unexpectedly emotional. What if the conversation goes well? Not perfectly. Just well. What if neither of you rushes? What if you both speak honestly? What if there is no dramatic resolution, only a feeling that something once frozen has begun moving again? They allowed themselves to picture what might come after. A second conversation. Then another. Perhaps a quiet meeting somewhere neither of you needs to perform. Perhaps coffee that lasts longer than expected. Perhaps a walk where old tension slowly turns into laughter. Perhaps asking questions you should have asked long ago. What changed for you? What do you need now? What are you afraid of? What would make this feel different? And somewhere beyond those conversations, they imagined a future built differently from the past. Not a future where you never disagree. A future where disagreement does not automatically become distance. Not a future where uncertainty never appears. A future where uncertainty gets spoken before it becomes confusion. Not a future where neither of you has fears. A future where fear no longer gets to make every decision. This vision became so vivid that they wrote another line. I don't want a perfect future with you. I want an honest one. Simple. But powerful. Because perfection had never really been the goal. Peace was. Trust was. Knowing that if something changed, both of you could speak about it. Knowing that love did not have to survive through guessing. Knowing that closeness could be something you actively create rather than something you constantly fear losing. And something inside the person you love began to understand why your connection had affected them so deeply. It was not only because of attraction. Not only because of memories. You represented a challenge to the way they had always approached closeness. They could remain distant with most people and feel safe. With you, distance did not feel like safety for long. It felt like unfinished business. You made them confront the possibility that real connection requires being seen. And being seen had always frightened them. Because when someone truly sees you, they can also truly matter. And when someone matters, you cannot pretend you are untouched by the possibility of losing them. That was the fear beneath everything. Not love itself. The vulnerability love created. Now they finally had language for it. I was not running from you, they wrote. I was running from the part of myself that could no longer pretend I didn't need anyone. There. Another truth. Perhaps the deepest one so far. The letter had begun as a confession about you. It had become a confession about themselves. Their fear of needing. Their fear of hoping. Their fear that if they allowed themselves to imagine a future with you, they would have something meaningful enough to lose. But here is what changed. They realized that avoiding meaningful things does not protect a person from loss. It simply guarantees they never fully experience what could have been gained. And that realization finally broke something open. Tomorrow no longer looked like a threat. It looked like an opportunity to stop living from an old rule. An old rule that said, stay quiet until you are certain. Stay guarded until there is no risk. Do not reveal too much first. Never be the one who cares more. Protect yourself. They had followed those rules for years. But those rules had not given them peace. They had given them control. And control, they now understood, was not the same thing. So they crossed something out in the letter. A sentence near the beginning. Originally it said, "I'm sorry I wasn't ready." They looked at it. Then rewrote it. "I'm sorry I kept waiting to feel completely ready before giving you the honesty you deserved." That was more accurate. Because readiness had become an excuse. There would always be another question. Another fear. Another reason to wait. Tomorrow was their choice to move before every uncertainty disappeared. And this is where something truly unexpected happened. They suddenly remembered one thing you once told them. You had said, perhaps jokingly, perhaps seriously, "One day you're going to realize that you don't have to know the entire future to take one honest step." At the time, they may have smiled. They may even have disagreed. Tonight, those words returned with extraordinary clarity. One honest step. That was all tomorrow needed to be. Not the entire future. Not a lifetime decided in one morning. One honest step. They wrote those 3 words at the very top of the letter. One honest step. And now the page felt complete. Actually complete. No more rewriting. No more searching for stronger phrases. No more trying to predict your reaction. The letter said what it needed to say. They gathered the pages. Then they did something you might not expect. They read the entire letter aloud as though you were already sitting across from them. Slowly. Every paragraph. Every pause. When they reached certain lines, their voice became quieter. When they reached the parts about the future, they stopped more than once. But they continued. This was their rehearsal. Not for performance. For courage. And when they reached the confession, "I wrote this because I finally stopped pretending that love was the part one was uncertain about." They could barely move to the next sentence. That line had become the center of everything. Because it removed the story they had been telling themselves. The story that they needed more time to understand how they felt. No. Time had already answered that question. The real question was whether they would act like someone who understood. Then they read the last line. "So tomorrow, I am not going to wait for another sign, I am going to tell you myself." Silence filled the room. And afterward, something unusual happened. They laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because they suddenly recognized how complicated they had made something that now felt strangely simple. They cared. They had been afraid. They waited. Waiting did not make the truth disappear. Now they were going to speak. 4 sentences. The entire emotional maze reduced to 4 sentences. And perhaps that is what happens when a person finally reaches clarity. The story does not become less meaningful. It becomes less confusing. But then their eyes went back to the question on the reverse side. What would you want us to do differently? That question reminded them that tomorrow was not only about their courage. It was about your voice. They imagined your answer. Perhaps you would say, "Communicate." Perhaps, "Don't disappear when things get real." Perhaps, "Give me consistency." Maybe you would say something they had never considered. Maybe what you need now is completely different from what you needed before. And they wanted to know. Not guess. No. That was the future they were finally imagining. A future where both people speak their needs without turning them into tests. Where neither of you expects mind reading. Where silence is not used as proof of love. Where boundaries do not feel like rejection. Where space can exist without becoming abandonment. Where closeness does not require either person to lose themselves. This was becoming bigger than a love confession. It was a blueprint for emotional maturity. And perhaps that is why the final confession changes everything. Because, "I love you" alone might have returned you to the same story. The actual confession contains something more valuable. "I am ready to do this different." By the time they reached that hidden paragraph, one uncomfortable truth had become impossible to ignore. You had changed. Not in the way people usually mean when they say someone has changed. You had not become colder. You had not stopped caring. You had simply stopped placing your entire peace in the hands of unanswered questions. And somehow, the person you love noticed. Maybe not immediately. Maybe not while it was happening. But over time, something about your energy became different. You no longer seemed to be standing in the same emotional doorway, waiting for them to decide whether they were coming in. You started moving. Quietly. Purposefully. You started building days that did not revolve around whether a message arrived. You started protecting your attention. You became more selective about what deserved access to your heart. And the strangest part? That did not make them feel less connected to you. It made them finally understand your value. There is a sentence in the secret letter that they almost removed because it made them confront something they had avoided for too long. "I think I only understood how strong you had become when I realized you were no longer asking me to recognize it." Read that slowly. Because there is a difference between proving your worth and living from it. At one time, perhaps you wanted them to see certain things. Your loyalty. Your patience. Your sincerity. The way you kept showing up even when the situation felt unclear. But somewhere along the way, you stopped needing recognition in order to know what you had brought to the connection. That shift mattered. And they saw it. They noticed that you were no longer sending the same signals. No longer creating easy openings just to see if they would finally walk through one. No longer carrying every conversation. No longer making excuses for uncertainty that was not yours to solve. You had begun choosing yourself without turning that choice into punishment. That was what surprised them. Because they had expected one of two things. Either you would continue waiting exactly where they remembered you. Or you would become completely distant. You did neither. You simply became more grounded. More difficult to confuse. More willing to let action speak louder than potential. And this new version of you unsettled them in the best possible way. It forced them to face a question they could no longer avoid. If I finally come forward, am I coming because I am truly ready, or because I am afraid someone else will recognize what I took too long to understand? That question stayed in the room. They did not like it. But they needed it. Because fear of losing someone can sometimes imitate clarity. And the person you love did not want tomorrow to be driven by panic. They wanted it to be driven by truth. So they examined themselves again. Would they still want this conversation if they knew nobody else was entering your life? Would they still write this letter if they believed you would remain available indefinitely? Would they still choose honesty if there were no pressure at all? The answer came quietly. Yes. And that answer gave them relief. Because this was not simply urgency created by competition. It was urgency created by awareness. They had begun to understand that time is not guaranteed emotional access. People grow. Circumstances shift. Opportunities change shape. And the person who once waited patiently can eventually become the person who says, I still care, but I no longer abandon myself to prove it. That possibility changed the way they looked at tomorrow. Until then, tomorrow had felt like their moment. Their confession. Their decision. Now they understood something much bigger. Tomorrow belonged to both of you. They could arrive with honesty. But they could not arrive with entitlement. They could not assume that because they had finally reached clarity, your heart had remained frozen in the same place. So they added another sentence to the letter. I know my timing does not automatically become your timing. That line may be one of the most important in the entire message. Because it carries respect. They are not asking the past to disappear just because they have finally found courage. They understand that your growth deserves to be honored too. And then came an even deeper realization. Perhaps your growth was part of what made their confession possible. Think about that. When you stopped pulling for answers, they had nowhere left to hide from their own silence. When you stopped constantly reaching, they began hearing the absence of your reaching. When you stopped trying to manage the connection alone, they had to decide whether they were willing to carry any part of it themselves. Your stillness became a mirror. Not a punishment. A mirror. It showed them what happened when your effort was removed from the equation. And what remained? Their feelings. Their memories. Their unfinished truth. Their responsibility. They could no longer tell themselves the connection existed only because you kept it alive. You had stepped back. And somehow, it still lived inside them. That was proof they could no longer dismiss. The letter says, when you became quiet, I expected everything inside me to become quiet too. It didn't. That sentence frightened them. Because it removed another excuse. If your presence was not actively pulling at them, why were they still thinking of you? Why were they still protecting memories? Why were they still imagining conversations that had never happened? Why did the future keep placing you inside it? There was no external pressure anymore. Only internal truth. And that changed everything. They began realizing that your silence had not erased the connection. It had clarified where the connection actually existed. Inside choice. Inside memory. Inside possibility. Inside the part of them that had finally stopped pretending. Now stay with this. Because the hidden paragraph does not end there. It goes further. They write. I noticed that you became more peaceful when you stopped trying to understand me. That sentence hit them harder than almost anything else. Because it made them confront the cost of their inconsistency. Your peace increased when you stopped studying their behavior for answers. That meant something. It meant the connection had once asked too much emotional interpretation from you. Too much guessing. Too much decoding. Too much wondering what a silence meant. And now the person you love sees how exhausting that must have been. Not because they intended to create confusion. But because intention did not change the effect. That realization brought them back to the question on the reverse side of the letter. What would you want us to do differently? For the first time, they imagined one answer you might give. Make me feel like I don't have to guess. They closed their eyes. Because perhaps that was it. Perhaps that was the thing they had been missing all along. You were never asking them to predict the future. You were asking them to be clear in the present. And now they wanted to become capable of that. So they began forming a promise. Then stopped themselves. They had already decided not to make promises too large to prove. Instead, they wrote something more grounded. If you give me space to speak with you again, I want you to judge me by what I consistently do, not by what I say in one emotional moment. That was different. No demand for immediate trust. No request that you forget everything. Just accountability. Watch what happens next. Watch whether the words become behavior. Watch whether tomorrow becomes a pattern instead of a performance. The person you love understands that one beautiful letter cannot carry an entire future. But it can mark the beginning of one. And that distinction matters. They are not presenting the letter as proof that everything is fixed. They are presenting it as proof that hiding is ending. What comes after will require something harder than writing. Consistency. That word appears twice near the bottom of the page. Once in the main text. Once in the margin. Almost as if they were reminding themselves. Do not ask for what you are not prepared to maintain. And then something happened that changed their understanding of you again. They remembered a moment when you walked away from a conversation without creating a scene. No dramatic ending.